Winslow Hansen. I'm an assistant scientist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. Just wanted to start off by thanking everyone who's joining us for the weekly seminar series today. It's going to be a really great talk, but before I introduce our speaker, just a little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you that are new or not from Carey, if you could tell us where you're calling in from in the chat, that would be great. And if you have any technical difficulties, that can go in the chat as well. If you have questions for our speaker, we'll do those at the end and I'll facilitate that, but please put your questions to the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. And be aware that we have a whole series of exciting talks coming up after this week. So on March 3rd, we have Dr. Liam McGuire from University of Waterloo. And then on March 10th, our own Dr. Evan Gora will be presenting. But this week, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carly Ziter. She is an assistant professor at Concordia University in urban ecology. She did her master's degree at McGill University before jumping across the border to do her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with Dr. Monica Turner, where I overlapped with Carly for 4 years and got to know her. I can credit her with introducing me to butter tarts, among other things. And I'm forever grateful for that, of course, for anybody that's had a butter tart.
Canadian delicacy.
Right. So Carly's a wonderful person to have give a talk because her research covers a wide range of subjects, from really hardcore biogeochemistry to urban heat islands to community-based science and working with local partners. And on top of that, she's a recognized extraordinary science communicator. So it's kind of the full suite of skills that you look for in a seminar speaker. And originally, Carly was supposed to present in spring of 2020 to Carey. Unfortunately, the world intervened, and here we are 2.5 years later or so. And it's just my absolute pleasure to get to make sure that she gives that seminar that's been long overdue. So I'll pass it over to Carly, and I really look forward to your talk. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, thank you for a lovely introduction, Winslow. It seems like just yesterday we were back in the Turner Lab, and Winslow was encouraging me to apply for this job that I have now at Concordia. So today I'm going to talk to you about understanding biodiversity and ecosystem services across our urban landscapes, which is, I've given myself a really lofty title here that I'm sure I'm still going to be working on, decades from now. And I'm going to start by acknowledging a few people. And so some of the work I'll present today was done with colleagues in Madison, Wisconsin, where I did my PhD. I left there about 3 years ago. And so thank you to a number of colleagues and collaborators up here and a number of local organizations. I really wouldn't be able to do my work without a lot of on-the-ground support from local groups and of course, lots of funders. As I progress through the talk, I'll move more into the work we're doing now in Montreal, and I'll introduce you to some new people and partners throughout. So I really got my start in research and developed my love for ecology as a pretty standard, boots on the ground field ecologist. As an undergrad in Ontario, Canada, I was fortunate to work in really incredible aquatic and terrestrial systems throughout North America during my degree. And my master's degree was spent exploring the fields and the forests of Quebec's working landscapes, where I went out and measured thousands of trees. Throughout my PhD and now into my current position, I, and now my students, you can see a few of them here, have transitioned to working in sites that look a little more like this, maybe a little more familiar to some of you who live in a city. We still do mostly field-based kind of boots on the ground ecology, but we've traded these wilder and working landscapes for the living landscapes that make up our cities, our towns, our own backyards. And that transition really brought me to my current role at Concordia, where I wear a few different hats. And so I am incredibly privileged to lead the Urban Landscape Ecology Lab in our biology department with a wonderful group of trainees from undergrads up to postdocs. And I'm also a member of a very interdisciplinary cluster on sustainable cities, full of engineers and artists and philosophers. And we collaborate together across these disciplines to think about cities of the future. And this really informs the broader perspective of my work. And I love sitting in this kind of messy middle where I get to ground my work and ideas in the biology that I'm trained in, but increasingly reflect in a much more serious way about how to connect across fields, how to combine methodologies to do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. And part of the reason that this kind of ecology, this urban ecology, is so important to me is that we live in an increasingly urban world. So urban land use is among the fastest growing land use classes worldwide. And the result of that is that recently, for the first time in history, we hit this milestone where more than half our planet's population is urban. Of course, here in Canada, there in the States, you passed this milestone quite a while ago where 4 out of 5 Canadians and Americans live in cities. And many scientists, myself included, have really been grappling with what this rapid urbanization means for biodiversity, for human well-being. So where and how do we actually conserve nature in an urban world? And we can take a really broad perspective and look at this from a global scale, where we know urbanization presents some serious challenges. We are building the equivalent of a city with the population of London, England every few months. These cities are going to sprawl into natural habitat, releasing carbon, damaging some of our most vulnerable coastal regions. We disproportionately build on the coasts. But this isn't just about global numbers. Challenges of urbanization exist across a range of scales. For example, we see biodiversity change as a result of local extinctions or colonizations, all the way through to the global spread of invasive species. Urban infrastructure affects ecosystem services locally. For example, the increase in urban heat, something I think a lot about, through to effects of development on global carbon and nutrient cycles. But these challenges, even though they get a lot of attention, they're not really where I like to spend most of my time. Personally, I'm more interested in thinking about where there may be opportunities to improve biodiversity, to improve well-being in this urban world that we find ourselves in. And many of these opportunities here in blue, they skew local. So really understanding, our small scale habitats and how we can integrate biodiversity into urban planning, or thinking about the role of biodiversity and ecology in promoting livability. And so I really do think that to work towards a more sustainable urban world, we need to improve our understanding of the ecological fabric of our cities and our neighborhoods. So that's the space that I like to think about most often. And to start understanding these ecosystems, these urban landscapes, we really need to recognize that they differ hugely from surrounding areas. So cities are home to different mixtures of species. They're characterized by really high spatial heterogeneity at really fine scales, and they're temporally dynamic. We have frequent changes in land use and management. And cities are often so different from the surrounding ecosystems that it's sometimes hard to recognize where they are. So we're going to take a minute and we're going to play a little game of Guess That City, where I would like you to put in the chat where you think this is. No cheating if you've seen me use this slide before, if some of you have attended a seminar, but where do you think this is? You can guess the city, you can guess the region, the state, the province, the country. You could even guess a continent if you want to really start broad. Okay, I'm getting a China, a Florida. Yeah, there's some pools. North America, Melbourne. Yeah, it looks like a warm place. California, 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 USA. All right, so we're really drawing in on California here. Brazil, that's a new one. Okay, some of these are getting closer. So this is Singapore. So often I get a lot of guesses for California and for USA. I think the pools maybe, or the red roofs, but this is actually Singapore. And so you can see, all of you very highly educated people who are familiar with ecology. If I dropped you in this city, you'd be like, I don't know where I am. And these changes, this altering of these urban ecosystems, of the structure, the function, the biodiversity that's there, eventually alters the benefits we get from those ecosystems. And that has been a really major focus of my research program as it's developed. And ecologists are starting to pay attention to this. So while historically, ecosystem services research has really focused on more natural or production-based systems, we've seen a really rapid increase in the number of these studies in cities across the world. At some point, I'm going to have to stop using this figure because it's getting really out of date. And I'm sure now this line will be right off the top of this slide in terms of the number of urban ecosystem services papers. Now, before I continue, I want to take a step back and think about this term that I keep using, which is a term that's used differently by different people. And when I say ecosystem services here, I'm really using this as a way to draw attention to the ways people depend on the environment or the benefits we get from ecosystems. So you might hear this as, nature's benefits, nature's gifts, nature's contributions to people. But a really important part of this concept is that humans are really instrumental in mediating the provision of these benefits in some way. So most of the benefits we receive from the environment don't just magically flow from nature to us without any intervention. They are a product of social ecological systems in many cases. And so these include things that we actually use or manage or extract from ecosystems like timber. We benefit through the regulation of ecosystem processes, wetlands throughout our landscapes, reduce flooding and erosion, store carbon. And of course, we derive value from nature in all kinds of intangible ways. So the enjoyment of a hike to see the fall colors in a nearby state park, or maybe a snowshoe is a better seasonal example here. This framework can encompass these sorts of relational values as well. And this is a really interdisciplinary field, which as a kind of perpetual academic dabbler is one of the reasons I love it. And so you might be familiar with this term through economics, putting a monetary value on nature, or the social science of who has access to these benefits. The kind of work my students and I do most tends to focus on the ecology of ecosystem service provision. So the processes, functions, and biodiversity underlying how and where these benefits are produced on the landscape. And we're slowly branching into some of these more cultural or relational values of how people perceive and interact with nature as well. Okay, so let's come back to the city here. We're often pretty quick as ecologists to paint a negative picture of cities and the environment. We don't necessarily think of cities, and there's my lights going off, as areas where nature is benefiting us or is even present. But once you start looking, depending where you live, you'll notice there's actually quite a lot of green space surrounding us. So these parks and yards and spontaneous vegetation around the railway tracks, these patches of green all really have the potential to make our cities better places for us to live. And so natural spaces provide city residents with places to recreate. Whenever I give a seminar, I like to check the things to do here on TripAdvisor, and a park or a green space or a blue space is almost always in the top 10. It's often the top 1. People really appreciate these spaces in their environment. And of course, we've seen that firsthand over the last 2 years. So this is a Canadian survey led by a really great organization called Parks People that showed 70% of Canadians say their appreciation for parks and green spaces in their urban environment has increased throughout COVID. More than 80% said parks are more important for their mental health. We also see studies of these regulating services that urban ecosystems provide. So some cities can store as much carbon as some of our really carbon-rich ecosystems, often in their soils. And while we might associate cities with common or even invasive species, urban areas can also act as a refuge for rare species that provide real conservation value alongside benefits for people. So there has been some great work coming out in recent years highlighting the potential of urban green spaces to act as a refuge for important pollinators, for example. And these services are locally important. Cities are where most people interact with nature most often. But they're also regionally significant. So this is Wisconsin's Yahara watershed, where I conducted much of my past work. And you can see in red here, about 25% of that land is urbanized. There's a city smack in the middle of that watershed. This is where I work now in Montreal, where we have this large city really embedded within this broader region. So if we want to think about sustainable watersheds, sustainable regions, sustainable landscapes, we can't ignore the cities within them. But despite this increasing attention, ecological research in cities, ecosystem service research in cities still tends to lag behind other ecosystems. And so even though, some of you in the chat have been doing this kind of research much longer than I have, but we still see a lot of studies that are focusing on a single service at a time, for example, which makes it difficult to address synergies or trade-offs or manage for multiple benefits. And we still see, when we look at the underlying ecology, which component of that system is assumed to provide these benefits, many studies are relying on kind of habitat or land cover based proxies. So we're extrapolating from land cover maps, often based on relationships from non-urban systems. Now, again, these figures are a little out of date. I think we've pushed a little bit further from this time, but we're still seeing a lot of extrapolation from land cover. And that can really ignore some of the high heterogeneity of these urban landscapes. So for example, we'd assume, from a map that these residential areas might be similar in their ecology, in their service provision, but we can see on the ground that they're actually quite different in terms of their vegetation and their structure. For another example, we can look at these urban grasslands, some of my past field sites, where we have everything from a diverse, forb-dominated prairie restoration through to a kind of degraded meadow of weedy invasive species on the former city dump. So how might our understanding of these systems change if we really considered this variation? And focusing on current land cover also ignores the past, even though we know that past land use affects many aspects of our ecosystems. So for example, we know that past agriculture continues to influence forested areas for decades or centuries. We still have a lot to learn about the effects of past land use on our urban systems, even though all our cities used to be something else. So that was a really long-winded kind of introduction. But as I developed my research program throughout graduate school, I really wanted to focus broadly on the ecology of ecosystem service provision and think about how these things come together, how historical land use, current landscape structure, biodiversity influence these different ecosystem services, both today and looking forward into the future. I'm going to give you a really kind of some quick snapshots of some past projects I've done just to give a sense of the breadth of what we think about in the lab. And then I'm going to dig a bit further into a few different vignettes of this work. So working within this framework might look like studying how historical agricultural practices and our current landscape come together to affect our soils, how they store carbon, contribute to flooding, contribute to water quality. We're continuing these lines of research now. So we have new graduate students who are looking at legacy effects on soil biodiversity and function here in Montreal, as well as legacy effects on urban forest structure. I won't talk about them today. This framework can also involve how changes to biodiversity, sometimes unexpected changes, might affect our urban landscapes. So for example, working with community scientists to understand how invasive species are spreading throughout our landscape, the influences that it's having. So we've done some work on earthworms in the past in this lens. Or how the way we structure our landscapes, where we pave, where we add buildings, where we plant trees, can influence the temperature of our cities. And I'm going to move forward here, maybe not, there we go. And how the decisions we're making today might affect the resilience of those cities in the future. This project I'm going to jump into in more detail in a couple of slides as kind of a launching off point for some of our current work. Now, those examples were all past work that I really developed as a student that shaped the way I think about urban nature. And I'm going to share a more complete story of one of those papers with you. But then I'm going to spend some time today talking about new stuff we're working on here in Montreal. And I'm about 3 years into my position. And so I feel like my new lab is really just starting to kind of hit its stride. And so I want to lean into that today and talk a bit about what it looks like when you move beyond just leading your own projects to directing a whole team of people. Because I don't think we always acknowledge what that process looks like at the start of a research career. And one of the best parts of being a professor is you get to pick your team. And so this is my current team. Well, we've got some past students in there. We've had some new students come in. But we all work together on this research vision of conducting solution-oriented science to try and enhance biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service provision in our urban landscapes. And the way I like to explain our lab's work and our goals is that we think about the ways that cities, or more accurately, the people that live in them, need nature. And then on the flip side, how nature can better survive or even thrive in these urban areas that we are largely in charge of managing. So nature needs us to make better choices about our cities. Of course, sometimes these two go together, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and sometimes they don't, which is one of the big questions we're always kind of thinking about. I'm mostly going to talk about this piece up here today, the benefits of nature for people. But if you're really interested in that bottom part, we are growing to do more work focused on particularly pollinator and avian diversity. So let's start with cities need nature. And I'm going to focus on trees here because I love trees. And because in the temperate zone cities I tend to work in, trees do a really, really good job of improving our urban spaces. So those of you who teach or do outreach especially may have seen infographics like this. All these wonderful things that trees do or provide for us. But where do these numbers come from? We're always trying to do a better job as scientists of measuring and mapping these benefits so we can then inform the decisions people make about trees. And something I am particularly interested in and particularly concerned about is the ability of trees to cool our cities in a warming world. And so at the core of this work is the urban heat island effect, which describes the higher temperatures found in cities. In the city, we pave over green space, we alter the energy budget relative to surrounding areas, but you don't need to understand energy budgets or biophysics to be familiar with this phenomenon because it's something many of us have experienced. Thinking about standing in a parking lot on a really hot day compared to being, out in the forest outside the city. And while a few extra degrees might seem kind of nice at this time of the year, it's snowing out my window, this is really important from a human health perspective. So in the US, heat-related deaths outpace all other mortality due to extreme weather. High urban temperatures increase energy use, air pollution, cause a whole host of other issues. Meanwhile, our cities are growing more crowded and hotter over time as climate warms. Even, as a Canadian living way up north here, eating my butter tarts, this is something that really affects the communities where I live and work. So for example, when I was young, we would have about 8 days of the year over 30 degrees here in Montreal. By the time I retire from my new job, we will have about 50 days of the year over 30 degrees, which, as I learned from working in my unair conditioned home this past summer, is pretty hot. So decision makers want to cool cities down, but the best ways to do this aren't always clear. And that's partly because much of our research has focused on these kind of urban-rural differences. Or increasingly, as we do studies within cities, we're focusing on things like the park cool island effect. So how the size and shape and distribution of parks affects air temperature. Those cool islands are really important, but we also know that urban heterogeneity encompasses so much more than this dichotomy of built up areas versus parks. So to improve climate adaptation strategies, we need a better understanding of how temperature varies at the scales where we live. So we wanted to think about how those fine scale changes in land cover might affect air temperature. And air temperature is a really important metric for public health. It gets us a little closer to health impacts than the land surface temperature measurements we often use for spatial work. We did this in Madison, Wisconsin. Fortunately, I had a great baseline to work from in Madison, as work done by my colleagues, including Dr. Jason Schatz and Dr. Chris Kucharik, had shown that we have a distinct urban heat island in Madison. So those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Madison, it's a city located between a chain of lakes. And so that's what you're seeing in black here. And this image of the heat island in August comes from interpolating between 150 of these stationary sensors, which lucky grad students get to climb up and replace the batteries of a few times a year. This map is really based on the percent of impervious cover. So we look at the temperature, we compare that to how much pavement we have, and we can model this urban heat island. Really great start. We wanted to build on that broader scale work to think more about local scale mitigation, particularly by the urban forest. So can we bring trees into this equation? And the reason that I look at trees is because the urban forest is always changing. And in many cases, we get to decide how. So we decide whether to treat or remove trees in response to invasive insects in our cities. We decide on policies for tree replacement, where and what kinds of new trees are planted, which means decisions we're making today, we being kind of collectively our cities are making today, might be dictating future temperatures. I also focus on trees because these are things people really care about and connect with. So this is a sign from my old neighborhood where someone had looked up the urban forest policies and then made a little hand-lettered sign to alert their neighbors to what was coming, the replacement of trees with shrubs. And so there aren't a lot of policies that people kind of care enough about to be going up and signing their neighborhood. And one of our key questions was how canopy interacts with impervious cover to alter air temperature. And we know that the coolest and the hottest ends of this spectrum, right? We know the forested park is going to be cool and the parking lot is going to be hot. But this overlap is not always addressed in a really clear way. And that's partly because this kind of nuance is hard to tease out with categorical sampling. So comparing a sensor, in a park versus a dense neighborhood, for example, might miss the middle ground that makes up a lot of our cities. So how do you catch the middle ground? How do you measure urban temperature at a really fine scale, like tens of meters, while capturing spatial change in all of these different explanatory variables on a grad student budget and timeline? And so in my case, you get really creative with your bicycle. And this is essentially a weather station. And so every second I record the temperature, the solar radiation, the GPS coordinates, which are saved to this data logger connected to a motorcycle battery. And what this corresponds to is a measurement every 5 meters in space that's geo-referenced. And this kind of mobile sampling looks really ridiculous, but is also a great example of how new technology is continuing to innovate the ways we do urban research. So stationary sensors are excellent for characterizing broad spatial patterns or quantifying temporal dynamics over long periods of time. Mobile sensors can capture the fine scale, and they can help us access otherwise hard to study areas. And other researchers are using these approaches as well. This is my colleague, Matt Adams in Toronto with his mobile air temperature lab. I have colleagues in other regions who have used, cars or motorcycles to capture these kinds of patterns. And so we sampled 10 transects multiple times, each during the hottest part of the day. And then we did a subset of those at night, but I'm going to talk about the daytime data today. And I'm going to zoom in on one example, this orange one over here today, just to give you a sense of what the raw data looks like, because the raw data is super compelling. So you can see from this satellite image that within the space of just a few kilometers, like a 10-minute bike ride, we're spanning really different combinations of canopy and impervious cover, from really densely canopied neighborhoods through to kind of more typical suburbia, through to the shopping mall parking lot. Now I'm going to use this white line, I'm going to color it in based on this temperature scale. For those of you working in Fahrenheit, this is something like maybe 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 81 to 89 or something. And so we're going to start over here. and we see the temperature changing as we move through this space, where we're going from 27 degrees, nice, cool in our forested park, just maybe less than a kilometer away, to 31 degrees in our parking lot. So we can see these fine scale changes in urban landscapes result in large fluctuations in temperature, but we had a lot of data. So how did we quantify these patterns? As mobile sensors become cheaper and easier, we're seeing a rise in this sampling technique, but the resultant data has not been dealt with very well. Thank you. We've got a conversion in the chat. 30 degrees is 86, so it's up to 88 or so at the higher end. So how do we deal with this data? I'm going to kind of zoom through a series of steps pretty quickly here. If you're interested in this, you can ask me or you can check out the paper. But first, we calculated a temperature anomaly for each measurement. So relative to the hot inner city, to these reference sensors, how hot or cool was it where we were biking? Then we calculated our covariates for each measurement. So at each point, we looked at the surrounding canopy and impervious cover using a 1 meter resolution data set. And we also looked at the distance to the nearest lake, since we know that there was going to be a cooling effect from that lake. And we did this at multiple scales. So from 10 meters to 30 meters to 60 meters to 90 meters in radius. And that's about the size of like one downtown lot through to the size of about a city block. And so really a very kind of human scale, a scale that you'd be moving around about your day, planting or removing trees, making small adjustments to the city. We use generalized additive models, or GAMs, as a flexible approach to model these relationships. So something that would let us have a kind of wiggly line if it was there. This included our covariates. It included a term for latitude and longitude to account for any additional spatial structure. And we accounted for the fact that we had these multiple rides on multiple transects. So we're trying to compare all of these kind of on the same scale. I'm not going to talk much about the lake effect in the results because it's very localized, but know that it is accounted for in these models. Now, the nature of this kind of high frequency mobile data means we get a lot of residual autocorrelation. And so to account for that temporal autocorrelation, the approach we ended up using after lots of going back and forth with the biostatisticians on our team is to split our data into 100 subsets of 1% of the data each. So we took, but evenly spaced. So imagine that we're stringing out all our bike data in a line. Model 1 would have the first measurement, the 101st, the 201st. Then we'd take the next, the second, 102nd, all the way through until we had 100 different models. And then we averaged our predictions and standard errors across those. And this allowed us to avoid including kind of adjacent points that might be autocorrelated in the same model, but really take advantage of the richness of this data set. When you have biked like hundreds of miles, you're not giving up any of that data. And so you'll see these averaged results. Here, I'm going to show you those smooth relationships. And we're going to start with impervious cover on the bottom. So we're going percent impervious cover. Each of these panels is a different scale. So going from local up to neighborhood. And this is that air temperature anomaly. So how much cooler or hotter was it than our reference point in the center of the city? And impervious, remember, is what we usually base these models on. And so as we'd expect, as we pave an area, our temperature goes up pretty linearly. As we look at a broader area, we tend to get a stronger relationship. So if you're paving your neighborhood, you are getting about a degree of warming in the size of a city block. Now, what happens when we add canopy to the mix? Canopy has a cooling effect. Again, we might expect that. Trees cool this down. But there's two things I really want to point out here that were interesting about these results. And the first is that the magnitude of the canopy effect was actually greater than impervious. So going from 0 to 100% impervious was going to warm the air by about a degree. But if we could go from 0 to 100% canopy, we would get about a degree and a half of cooling. So during the day, it is possible to offset this urban heat if you can get enough trees into that system. This relationship was also non-linear, particularly at the larger scales. So we had to get past this threshold of about 30 to 40% canopy cover to really get into that kind of stronger cooling zone. So let's put these two trends together and look at that space between canopy and impervious. What I want you to focus on here, all of these black points are where we had empirical data. So our bike covered this space really well. And you'll see at the 10-meter scale, you can have full canopy and full impervious. So imagine standing on a road, but you've got canopy cover overhead. You have both. As we move up in scale, you'll see those points shift out of that top corner because we can no longer fully overlap. And I want you to focus on the color scale. So as we increase in scale, we get about a 2-degree difference in temperature over 30 meters to just over 2 degrees to about 2.5 degrees as we get to the scale of a city block. And this is just by manipulating our canopy and our impervious. And this is an average across many different days, different weather conditions. So these differences are actually much greater on the hottest, clearest days, which is also when our health and our energy impacts are most consequential. And these differences are just as big as those urban-rural differences we tend to look at. So we don't see an urban heat island in the city, we see kind of an urban heat archipelago of multiple little islands of heat and cool. And so urban forest management is a powerful tool to mitigate daytime urban heat, but what does that actually tell us about where we should be planting or managing or retaining trees? So just looking at the data, if we had a limited number of trees and we wanted to get the most cooling, pushing neighborhoods kind of over that threshold into that greater area of cooling is going to give the biggest gains. But we do see that targeted local planting still has an effect to an extent. So you can still plant locally, but really pay attention to planting where it counts. So if you're planting a local tree that's going to have a lower effect, plant it right next to the bus station, right next to the walking path where people will feel it. And together, these mean that urban stakeholders and rights holders have a lot of agency over reducing daytime summer temperatures, but it will take collective action to get those more substantial levels of cooling. Now, probably the most important point here is that we don't want to use these kinds of results to support like a rich get richer approach to urban forestry. If we only do number one, we only push high canopy areas further, we are contributing to the environmental injustices that we know are already baked into so many of our cities. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about environmental justice or kind of tree equity today, but this is a really critical part of urban ecology. If you haven't read Dr. Chris Schell's really excellent paper on the systemic biases that underlie our ecology and evolution of our cities, I would encourage you to do so. And so I see these kinds of thresholds as something that we want to try and get all of our neighborhoods up to, rather than just focusing on the ones that already have a canopy. This is something that I did not give enough thought to in my earlier work, and that we're really trying to incorporate more into newer projects, this idea of environmental injustices and equity. And this work really reinforces a proposed rule that I appreciate a lot from my colleague, Dr. Cecile Konijnendijk, that proposes that everyone should be able to see 3 trees from their window, have 30% canopy cover in their neighborhood, and be 300 meters from the nearest park. And this emphasizes that we really need to be thinking of many of these kinds of critical tree-based ecosystem services, not at a full city scale, but at a neighborhood scale where those benefits are actually accessed. Now, after I wrote this paper, I got a lot of questions about tree planting. Who is responsible for planting urban trees? What does that mean for our neighborhoods? And we can take a look at an example of a residential area in Madison. First of all, if we want to reach high levels of canopy, we need to leave at least some space for trees. So here we have that space, canopy cover is high. Canopy is also governed by multiple stakeholders. So what would this space look like without, for example, private landowners? And it would look pretty different, not quite so green. So surpassing those higher canopy cover at scales where most people live and work really requires an all hands on deck solution. And this need for multi-stakeholder action is certainly true in many cities. So I'm using a slide for Toronto because they have nice data, but this situation is similar in many places where many of our trees are located on private land. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. Now, for the rest of the talk, the next 15 minutes or so, I'm not going to talk about kind of my work that I'm leading anymore. I want to just highlight some of the amazing work that my Concordia students are doing and how it builds on some of what we've already done. So I'm going to do this as a kind of rapid fire series of vignettes, probably too fast because I have crammed too many things into this talk, but I encourage you to get in touch and ask questions. So like most science, this work on urban trees answered some questions and raised a whole bunch of other ones. And one of those questions was kind of how dense is too dense? If we want to reduce temperatures and provide other kind of nature-based benefits, is that compatible with compact cities? And this is what Emily was really interested in for her master's. And the reason that density is so interesting is that we often hear about densification as a way to work towards more sustainable cities. There are a lot of good things that come with compact cities. They're good for people, they're walkable, they have good transit, and they're good for conserving biodiversity outside of that city footprint. So this idea of kind of land sparing. But ecosystem service provision also depends on green space being integrated throughout our cities. We saw how having enough space for trees is important to reduce temperatures. We know that access to green space is important for our mental and physical health. We know that vegetation can influence the quality of our air. So is there a point where we're getting too dense to receive some of these benefits where we live? And how do we strike that balance? So Emily picked 250 study sites across Montreal, each one about the size of that city block. And for each site, she calculated the building density, as well as a bunch of covariates, how much tree cover there was, where the major roads were, how wealthy the area was. And then she calculated indicators of ecosystem services linked to human health. So how hot was that site? How polluted was the air in that site? How accessible was green space, both in terms of ability to walk to a nearby green space, and did the residents have any access to their own private green space? And she found here we're going to see building density is always going to be on our x-axis here, increasing from low to high, and then our indicator on the y. And she found that there is a strong linear relationship. Sorry, my slides are advancing automatically, which is what happens when you steal slides from your students and don't check them. And so we see this strong linear relationship where as we increase in building density, we also get higher temperatures. That's what we would expect, right? We get higher surface temperatures as we get more dense buildings. Of course, this depends what's around those buildings. So within this variation, a lot of this is explained by our canopy. So if we have a densely built area with lots of trees and green space, we're going to be cooler than a densely built area with lots of parking lots. But in general, these dense parts of our city are often very hot the way our current neighborhoods are built. It's really hard to achieve both density and cooling. Air pollution tells a different story. I want you to focus less on the numbers here, more on the general trend, which is to say there isn't one. So at the scale we measured, air quality actually was not related to buildings or vegetation. It was really driven by pollutants, primarily major roads and industrial sites, so car infrastructure. When we look at access to green space, we see a marginally significant increase in our access, our distance to green space as we get higher building density. But really, our green spaces in Montreal are pretty well distributed. Whether you live in a lower density area or a more suburban part of the city or a higher density area, you're usually pretty close to a park to walk. But of course, we lose access to that private green space. So as we get into higher density areas, we really need to be considering, are we offsetting that loss of private green space with more publicly accessible areas? And in many cases, we are not necessarily. So if you live in a lower density part of the city, you're getting public and private access compared to these higher density areas. So there are some equity questions here. So the extent to which densification impacts our access to these different ecosystem services really depends on the service we look at, which is typically the answer we get when we do these multiple ecosystem service studies. It depends. Depending what we want, what we prioritize, we may need to plan differently. But while we set out to look at building density, lots of the things that reduced these benefits were actually related much more to car infrastructure than to buildings. So parking lots driving up the temperature and reducing space for greenery, major roads reducing air quality. And so reducing automobile dependency is really key. And that goes beyond ecology, that goes beyond my training. And that takes working with architects, with planners, with engineers, which is exactly what we're trying to do now. So a big new direction for our lab is working with the Design Lifes group. This is an NSERC Create, which is a big Canadian training grant. And the idea is to train engineers, landscape architects, and ecologists, scientists together to create and manage living and green infrastructure. And so we have projects looking at ruelles vertes or green alleys in Montreal, or the effects of green roofs. So in these dense areas where we don't have enough space for the trees that we usually study, are there other solutions that can contribute both to cooling and to access to a healthier environment? So the last area that I said I'd come back to, and the last little vignette I'm going to give you, is this idea of land use governance as being really critical for ecosystem services and for urban nature. And so this idea of where our trees are, how they're managed in the city, being an important factor of what our environments look like. And this is what Kaylee Hutt-Taylor was really interested in. She was really interested, Kaylee worked in a plant nursery for years and was really interested in this idea of people's choices and preferences in driving our urban forest. And if this video works and if I can share my sound, I'm gonna rest my voice for a minute and let Kaylee explain to you her project that she's been working on.
My name's Kaylee Hutt-Taylor, and I am a master's student here at Concordia doing my master's in biology. We have a really great public inventory of all the trees on public land in our parks and along streets here in Montreal, but we know very little about trees on private land. We wanted to launch a pilot project that asked citizens to go out in their backyards and kind of explore their own urban nature by identifying their trees so that we could get a better idea of what the urban forest actually looks like. The urban forest is really important for a multitude of reasons, apart from the benefits they provide our communities by giving places to recreate, providing aesthetic value in our backyards. They play a big role in controlling urban air temperature. They reduce the effects of urban heat island. They improve our urban air quality, and they also sequester a ton of carbon. What brought me to Concordia was the value that they placed in this emerging field of urban ecology. It's really important to me to be able to ask these ecological questions in the places where they're really affecting people. People live in.
Okay, so you got a little promo for Concordia there too. We're recruiting, come join us. But Kaylee was really interested in trying to make some connections here between the biodiversity that we can support in cities. So for example, the species we plant, horticultural species that come from our regional pool, that establish this incredibly diverse set of species in cities, how does that kind of feed back into benefits for us? So really trying to start kind of getting through this, biodiversity through to function, through to service pathway that we see so often in ecology. But to understand the benefits of the urban forest, the first step is actually knowing what's there, knowing the species pool. And so Montreal, like many cities, has a really great public tree inventory. but about 50% of our trees, again, are on private land. So if we look at this nice map, we have all these little colorful dots are public street trees, and everything here in these backyards, in schools, in alleys is unaccounted for. So I told you we'd come back to that idea of needing all hands on deck for urban forestry to really achieve its goals. And so Kaylee was interested in, is our public tree database representative of the broader urban forest? So we have half a data set. We know about half the trees in the city, and like half the data sounds pretty good to an ecologist, right? That's a lot of data. The problem is we don't know if that data is representative of the whole. Kaylee originally was going to go knocking on doors and measure trees herself in people's yards. And then of course, COVID hit like a month before her planned field season. And we decided we didn't want her to be the new typhoid Mary in the neighborhood, and said, you've got to come up with something else. And so she really quickly pivoted to a strategy that combined traditional field inventories of public parks, of street trees, of institutions, with this community science project where she put out a call to the broader neighborhood and said, please go out there, take photos, use a piece of string, measure your trees, send us this information that we can use. And she had almost 100 participants over the summer in this project. And this is work in progress. These results are kind of hot off the press, but a quick snapshot. If we look across kind of equal sample coverage, so you can think of these as like a species accumulation curve turned on its side. At equal sample coverage, our private yards here in blue have significantly higher species richness than any of our other land cover types. 30% of the trees in Kaylee's database across this neighborhood were only found on private land. So we have high species richness, but the size distribution of those trees is much smaller. So if we look at the largest trees, so this is the DBH, or the diameter at breast height. If you're short like me, it's more like the diameter at neck height. These really big trees that are probably disproportionately important for providing a lot of our services are occurring in street right-of-ways in purple. And we see lots of other differences as well, but this is just highlighting a few big ones. So that data set of our public trees is not representative of the diversity or the size structure of our urban forest as a whole. What Kaylee is doing now is really digging into the traits of these trees. And she's using ecosystem service-based traits. So a framework developed by Diane Pataki and Megan Avolio, that instead of using traits we often use in forest ecology, like wood density or seed mass, she's looking at traits that are linked to things people appreciate and prefer about trees. So do they have nice fall color? Do they flower? Do they grow tall? And we're starting to get some results about this that's showing that not only are there differences in species, but there are differences in the traits of trees in these different green space types that might be providing us different benefits across the landscape. So this work is continuing with some urban partners. We're building a broader community science effort to expand to new neighborhoods. We're also working closely with social science colleagues to understand people's perceptions of trees directly from a few different projects. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to quickly wrap up here with some lessons from the city. And that was, I know, a rapid fire overview of lots of different projects we have going on in the lab. But through thinking about these things, cities, first of all, are really great places to ask spatial and temporal ecological questions. It's a great playground to be a landscape ecologist, while offering a chance to engage local communities, local people in science and conservation. Even though I didn't talk a lot about our historical work today, we see that, for example, the areas we paved or planted in the past are affecting today's temperatures. The trees we plant today will continue to influence ecosystem services decades or centuries from now. We need to think about time. Historically, a lot of urban ecology has used public land or public data as representative of all urban green space. But we know that many of these interesting patterns of service provision, of biodiversity, are happening in our front and backyards, in our informal green spaces. So taking into account that full mosaic of green spaces outside the park is really important to me. And we need to work together. So collaboration across fields and keeping an open mind is going to help us better understand the constraints of this system and allow us as ecologists to contribute our knowledge to actual changes that can take place in the city. And I'll end with, our actions matter. Decisions you make about your own property might not seem like much, but these can scale up to make big differences at the level of a city. With that, thank you so much for listening. If you have a question, I think you can pop it in the Q&A or the chat. I'll let Winslow handle that how he wants to handle it. You can also get in touch with me by email, on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you, and I would really like to see some of you in person in a few months if I can eventually make it down to Carey Institute for my planned visit.
Thanks so much, Carly, for that wonderful talk. Really great to see the new work that you've been doing with students. We have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just fire it up. The first one's from Peter Groffman. He thought it was really interesting, the densification analysis.
Yeah.
He was wondering if you thought there were positive feedbacks between densification and the limitations of cars. So would it be easier to get rid of cars if you had very dense housing in commercial districts?
That's a great question. And I guess my answer is I hope so. So when I think of this from a more, theoretical sense, a lot of the ideas behind compact cities and densifying is making the conditions right for people, to walk to work, to get this idea of the 15-minute city. You can get everything in a 15-minute walk. You don't need to drive as much. On the other hand, I live in a very dense neighborhood, and many of my neighbors still have cars and are very resistant to giving up those cars. And so I think there would be a feedback where as we densify, hopefully we can remove cars. I also think we're going to have to go through this painful transition where if we're serious about the climate crisis, if we're serious about better living spaces, we're going to have to create more incentives for people to get rid of cars and to use other forms of transit. But I do think that getting rid of cars would be a huge step towards greening our cities. We give a huge amount of space to car infrastructure that could be used for other things.
Great. If others have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a question here from Peter Ibsen, who said, "Great talk, Carly. I love to see your lab's upcoming work. What are your thoughts, ideas, methods for incorporating life cycle assessments into urban tree-based ecosystem services, such as water use for cooling trade-offs in Arab cities?"
Yeah, cool. So nice to see you, Peter, virtually. I think that's a great idea. I think the kind of work that I'm doing just based on the skill set that I have is often looking at, one piece of this puzzle. We're saying, okay, how much cooling are we getting or how much carbon are we storing? But of course, that doesn't happen in isolation. And so I think taking more of a life cycle perspective could give us really important information. And there are certainly areas where, planting trees maybe is not the best thing to do if that's going to take valuable water that's needed for other things. And that's why I think we also need more multi-service assessments where we're really saying, not just looking at the cooling, but looking at what are the other benefits we're getting from these trees, what are the disservices or the drawbacks of taking this kind of approach. I would love to work with people who know what they're doing to do that kind of life cycle assessment. Absolutely.
Great. So one last question from Rick Osfeld. Is the effect of trees on abiotic conditions / human health more modest if we take relative humidity into account?
Yeah, good question. I kind of want to throw that question to Peter, who would know more about this than I would in terms of thinking about humidity, but absolutely, humidity is going to be more important. It is going to be an important piece of how we perceive these temperatures. My understanding is that the humidity could go in either direction. So it might feel hotter or cooler depending on how your humidity is interacting with your temperature. This is something that we really wanted to include humidity in the urban heat work that we did, but the humidity sensors aren't fast enough, or weren't at the time fast enough for the approach that we wanted. But it's a good reminder that there are a lot of other elements that affect our perception of temperature that are different than the temperature we are measuring. So even things like standing in the shade and blocking that kind of direct solar radiation will feel much cooler than the actual kind of temperature degree, or having, a dry heat will feel better than a wet heat, for example. So I do think we have a long way to go still in terms of really connecting the ecological indicators with actual health and perception. And there are people doing studies now where they'll give little trackers to people to wear, to walk around, and they get, how did you feel in this environment, and the actual data. I think there's a lot of promise in that direction.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carly, for taking the time to talk with us today. It was really, really wonderful. And for those of you at Carrie, we're very hopeful that she'll be able to join us for a few days in early May. So let's keep our fingers crossed that she'll be able to visit. So thanks again, Carly, and everyone out there, thank you for attending, and we hope to see you next week.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming and for your questions. Very happy to continue the conversation on email if you want to shoot me a question that I didn't get to or didn't have a chance to answer.